I want to welcome everyone to the annual Shirley Graham and W.E.B. DuBois Lecture, sponsored each year by the Program in Africana and Latin American Studies. I'm Mary Moran. I'm the Interim Director of ALST, and I hope you've been enjoying the whole array of ALST Day events that have been happening since very early this morning, when people were running around this campus putting up balloons, which you might have seen. And I'm going to mention some of those people right now. We have had a real full day, starting with coffee and donuts this morning, to soup in the coop and spoken word performances by faculty and students in the middle of the day. They have been serving Chartwell's version of African cuisine all day in Frank. Hope you got a chance for some of that. And the people who have really made all that possible are our fantastic administrative assistant, Amanda Stewart, our wonderful program assistant, Nikita Johnson, and our terrific student intern, Isabel Gonzalez. So let's take them. Those of you who attended the spoken word performance in the coop today heard Professor Alicia Simmons give a really great mini biography of DuBois and who he was and why he's important and why we continue to recognize him with events like this. She read an essay of his that sounded like it could have been written yesterday, called On Agitation, which is a real wonderful, ironic statement about resistance and speaking back. DuBois is remembered for many accomplishments, including being the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard, helping to found the NAACP, founding and editing several influential publications, including The Crisis and Phylon, and for his empirical work in sociology and his theoretical contributions to Pan-Africanism. I also like to think of him as the intellectual spirit behind our program in Africana and Latin American Studies here at Colgate, because I know he was in many ways the intellectual guide for our founding director, Manning Marable. This program, with its emphasis on the cross-cutting ties of continuity, resistance, and creative innovation across the diaspora, brings together programs that in other institutions are separated out as area studies and ethnic studies, and we kind of melt them all together. And we've been doing that for 37 years now, 38 years. We are a long-standing program, and so we continue to celebrate DuBois' spirit today. Now I want to turn to the other person we need to thank for today, and that's my colleague, Jonathan Hislop, Professor of Sociology and Africana and Latin American Studies, who took on the work of organizing this lecture and bringing our distinguished speaker here today. So he will introduce our guest and join me in thanking him.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for everything you've been doing for ALST over the last year. President Casey, Dean Hux, students, colleagues, and friends, it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the 2018 Shirley Graham and W.E.B. DuBois lecture, and to introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Michelle Moy of Indiana University. We are today just 2 weeks away from the 11th of November, which will mark 100 years since the end of the First World War. And I think in America this anniversary is perhaps being noticed less than it should be, because actually the First World War was an extraordinarily important turning point in American history. It's really, I think, the moment at which America emerges as the dominant power in the world. And I think we need more historical reflection on that. Perhaps it's not being noticed so much because America didn't suffer the kind of casualties which the European countries did in World War I. And of course there's been a huge outpouring of emotion. But it is worth remembering that twice as many Americans died in the less than 2 years that America fought in the war, twice as many as in the Vietnam War. So it was a major turning point. Yet I think when we think about the World War, we tend to think about the Western Front and the trenches, and we forget not only about the Eastern Front, but also that the First World War was fought on the oceans of the world, in the Middle East, in East Asia, and importantly, what we're going to look at today, in Africa. And it was fought also by Africans in Europe. Last year we went to the graveyard of Notre Dame de Florette near Arras, and there in Picardy you have 40,000 French graves, and among them are the graves of the Muslim troops from Africa who fought and died in that war. I think often as a South African about the troops of the South African Native Labour Corps who drowned in the English Channel. But when we turn to Africa itself, thanks to the work of scholars like Professor Moyd, we've started to realise recently the enormous and actually catastrophic impact that the First World War had on Africa. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois realised and recognised this connection, because it was when he came to Paris in 1919 to lobby for the NAACP at the Paris Peace Talks that he convened the Pan-African Congress, which was to have such extraordinary impact on the world. So I think we can't understand present global position of America without the First World War, and we can't understand the First World War without Africa. And it's really important, I think, to have that global vision. And, there's now a bit of a debate about, was the First World War a fight for democracy, or was it a hopeless and pointless conflict? But certainly the Africans who died in the First World War were not being offered any democratic rights or future. I think as we think about this 100th anniversary, we need to think not only of people who are connected to our national loyalties, but to about the people all over the world who suffered and died from the nationalism and militarism of that era, and also to think about the way that some of that nationalism and militarism seems to be coming back to haunt us today. Now, I first became aware of Michelle Moyd's work through reading her wonderful book, Violent Intermediaries, African Soldiers, Conquest and Everyday Colonialism in German East Africa. And the work gives you an amazing insight into the African troops who were recruited by the Germans from the 1890s, involved in the colonization of East Africa, and then fought the most extraordinary campaign against the British, ranging from Kenya to the Congo to Mozambique, right across the whole course of the First World War. Violent Intermediaries, I think, was lavishly praised by reviewers in the leading journals in the field, especially for its skill in showing the experience of these troops and the way in which Michel Moyd constructed this history out of very scattered and fragmented sources. Professor Moyd is a graduate of Princeton, holds master's degrees from the Universities of Florida and Cornell, and she took her PhD at Cornell in 2008. She is the Ruth N. Hall's Associate Professor in the Department of History and Associate Director of the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society at Indiana University. She's recently been appointed Associate Editor of the American Historical Review, and her past career has included a fellowship at the Rework Program at Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin. Her main current project is an overview book about Africans in the First World War, which we really look forward to, and she has multiple other interests: labour and military history in Africa, the Ugandan War of 1979, and she also has a book in the pipeline for next year with Julia Komska and David Gramling, intriguingly entitled Linguistic Disobedience. I'm delighted to welcome Michel Moyd to give it to us.
Okay, I'm going to start my timer so I can keep track of myself. And actually, so thank you so much for the introduction, Professor Hislop and Professor Moran. And just one little plug, the Linguistic Disobedience book is out. So if you're interested in the topic, it's really an attempt to give people a set of ways to think about how to think about language in a difficult moment, such as the political moment we're living in right now. And it was a very different kind of thing for me to write, but I think if you're worried about this moment and the kinds of things that you're hearing, it's a book that's meant to give you some guidance in how to think about language and how we use it. So I'd also like to extend my thanks to the African and Latin American Studies program staff who were very helpful in getting me here, and to all of you for inviting me to give this important lecture, the Shirley Graham and W.E.B. Du Bois lecture. I'm really honored to be invited to do this, and I thank you all for being here on a cold fall day. Okay. So I am writing this big book on Africa and World War I. What I'm going to talk to you about today, though, is actually quite a small slice of the overall story. And I'm doing it basically because this is the story I know the best, but it's something that I'm working out in terms of how to understand what happened to African peoples at the end of the war as they transitioned, many of them, from one form of colonial rule to another. In this case, from German to British. I'll talk about the image that I have here later in the lecture, but let me go ahead and get started. In March 1964, two elderly African men from Tanganyika, Alphonse Musa and Saleh Umlele, attended the funeral of their former commander, General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, in Hohentorf, Germany. They had been soldiers, or askari, in the German East African Colonial Army, known as the Schutztruppe, which Lettow-Vorbeck had commanded between 1914 and 1918. The East African campaign of World War I had been long, grueling, and costly, somewhere on the order of probably 60,000 soldiers died, an untold number of porters who carried all of the soldiers' equipment, and something like 365,000 civilians who died mostly as a result of the influenza pandemic that struck right at the end of the war, and famine that was caused by military pillage that occurred throughout the war. Yet it also yielded an enduring mythology about the war in Africa, which was that this small army of loyal Askari of the German Schutztruppe had followed them to the bitter end of the war and had never been defeated in battle. Germany lost its colonies in Africa and the Pacific because it lost the war. And despite the efforts of so-called colonial revisionists, agitators who argued for trying to get the colonies back after the Versailles Treaty, in the 1920s and 1930s, they tried to keep a spotlight on the issue. Germany never formally regained colonial territories. The Askari's supposed loyalty to Germany, the place, the nation-state, the empire, is questionable. As I've argued elsewhere, this is the cover of my book, and I see you're selling it. They're selling it for me outside, which is lovely. So as I've argued in this book, most Askari fought for and with the Germans because they viewed them as their patrons, as their conduits to respectability within the colonial socioeconomic landscape of German East Africa. And just this image that I chose for the cover of the book, I think really captures this idea of respectability that I'm trying to convey throughout the book. What I argue is that men like the man depicted here were most concerned about being able to perform their masculinity through the accumulation of a household, the gathering of a household, which included at least one wife, but sometimes more than one, children, other domestic household members, and that was a marker of wealth as well as stature, and it was a way to define manhood, especially in a colonial era when many of the paths to respectability and manhood were closing down. The soldiers' loyalty to Leto Vorbeck, however, and the Schutztruppe might deserve a fuller hearing, however, in contrast to their loyalty to Germany. They developed a loyalty that grew out of comradeship forged before and during the campaign. Their view of Leto Vorbeck as their ultimate patron that bolstered this tie through comradeship. And you can see that kind of representation here in this postcard, which was produced as kind of a fundraiser in Germany to provide money for veterans who had fought in the First World War and who were struggling to make it in the post-war environment. So you can see that it's kind of a romanticized image of two soldiers walking their wounded officer off the battlefield. There's no blood, there's no death. It's just a lot of military men being comrades and doing what military men do. So from their perspective, Leto Vorbeck and other German officers embodied the key qualities that they held in high esteem. The German defeat and the resultant official departure from their former colony in East Africa left them high and dry. They had to find new paths through the changed imperial landscape of 1920s Tanganyika as the new British Mandate territory became known in 1920 after the Versailles settlement. They had to do this in a time of famine, pandemics, post-war recovery, and the departure of their former source of authority, their patrons, the Germans. So how did they do it? Today I want to explore with you African colonial soldiers' political possibilities after World War I through the example of the German East African Askari, but with reference to the wider history of African men who fought in World War I. I do so in order to peer into the post-war landscape beyond generalities which overwhelm in their incomprehensibility, the thousands who died in the influenza pandemic or due to famine, the thousands who were displaced by total war, the thousands pressed into military labor in one form or another, many of whom never returned home. The historian John Iliff gives us a subtler way to think about this moment in Tanganyika's history, pointing out that the end of the war was both ordeal and opportunity, and this is the phrase that I chose for my title today. So it was a time of both ordeal and opportunity for African peoples. His formulation captures the transition from war to peace, from German to British control in Tanganyika, from one lived experience of colonialism to another. Following Iliff, I ask in what ways was the war an ordeal for men like the Askari, and in what ways did it create opportunities? And what do their experiences reveal about wider experiences of the post-war interwar period in Tanganyika, and perhaps more broadly for Africa as a whole? So before turning to these questions, and in a gesture to this lecture's namesakes, I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight one corner of W.E.B. Du Bois's thinking that I think frames my own work on World War I. In his essay, The Souls of White Folk, published in Dark Water, Voices from Within the Veil in 1920, Du Bois explained the origin of World War I this way, and I quote, "The cause of war is preparation for war, and of all that Europe has done in a century, there is nothing that has equaled in energy, thought, and time her preparation for wholesale murder. The only adequate cause of this preparation was conquest, and conquest not in Europe, but primarily among the darker peoples of Asia and Africa. Conquest not for assimilation and uplift, but for commerce and degradation. For this, and this mainly, did Europe gird herself at frightful cost for war," unquote. Today I want to tell you about some of the men who carried out this conquest, the Askari and soldiers like them who fought in colonial armies across the continent, and how they experienced World War I as ordeal and opportunity. Their story can perhaps stand in for many others in the African history of World War I. So just to give you some reference points for what I'll be talking about today, and I'll try to gesture to these as I go through. First, I'll sketch a bit of background so that you can understand who the Askari were up to the moment of their commander's surrender in late November 1918 in Abercorn, Northern Rhodesia, which is today Mbala, Zambia. I will also briefly describe the roles of ex-Askari, or veterans, prior to 1914 to provide a basis for comparison to what happened to them after 1918. Second, I will outline some of what's known about the Schutztruppe Askari after November 1918 and how their experiences shaped their politics. Why was their political mode so conservative when in other places ex-soldiers became anti-colonial activists and in some cases even revolutionaries? In other words, in a time of radical potential, why did African veterans embody mainly conservative realities? And third, I'll conclude with a final section that reflects briefly on the ex-Askari's experiences alongside those of others after World War I, and offer some brief observations on why it makes sense to link military history with labor history in studying this era. So just to give you kind of a sketch of who these men were, there were about 2,600 Schutztruppe Askari at the beginning of the war in 1914. They were men who had been recruited from across different parts of the eastern half of the continent. And they were largely responsible for doing the work of maintaining the colony, beginning in 1890 to 1918. And this painting, which was done in the late 1890s in sort of a very typical landscape style, gives you a sense of what the Germans imagined colonial warfare to look like. And obviously, there are a lot of things left out here. The recruitment of the predecessor to the Schutztruppe began in 1889 to 1890. As I said, they were recruited from different locations across the eastern half of the continent. And they were recruited to fight against Tanzanian coastal elites who were seeking to oust the German company from increasing, the German East Africa Company, from increasing coastal encroachment and cultural affronts against the largely Muslim population. The defeat of the coastal elites laid the basis for these troops to begin establishing military administrative footholds across Tanzania. This is what we call the conquest in the 1890s. And what you see here in this painting provides a kind of sanitized view of what that warfare looked like in the German imaginary. If you look at this image, what you can see clearly are the German officers and some Askari in the kind of foreground, and maybe you can't see it that well in this lighting, and you also can't see it that well even with good lighting, but in the very back of the painting, you can see these dark, faceless, distant figures. Those are their opponents. So you can tell from this image what the German priority is. And there's no sense of the people that they're fighting against as anything other than sort of nameless, faceless figures. Up to 1914, they remained a small professional army whose presence as an occupying force was magnified by their ways of war, especially training and discipline that amplified their relatively small numbers, their use of Maxim guns against indigenous militaries that did not have them, and the auxiliary forces that accompanied them. They played central roles in building the colonial state. In contrast to this sanitized, bloodless image of colonial warfare depicted here, the Askari were responsible for extreme and devastating violence against subject populations, especially between 1890 and 1907, which was the age of conquest. And I'm happy to say more about this history in the Q&A if people are interested. Once Askari finished their active service in the Schutztruppe, many of them transitioned into new roles as veterans. They often remained close to hubs of administration and continued to benefit from extractive colonial politics and economics. They continued to exert significant influence around the military stations, with reports of corruption indicating that they continued to wield authority in the name of the state and to the detriment of local populations. They worked as police and reservists. They were called up to supplement active Askari units as necessary, and their officer patrons took care of them by giving them opportunities and connections. This is perhaps not surprising, but it is nonetheless worth noting because they played a part in amplifying the German colonial presence. So I have some examples that I can talk about briefly. One role that veterans often played was to continue working as freelancers, still assisting colonial military outfits, including scientific expeditions, for example, that were couched as peaceful expeditions, but which were almost always militarized because the people who were involved in these columns had equipment to protect, and they also usually were viewed as they were unwelcome as they passed through people's lands. So Askari often, in their retirement, continued to act as freelance soldiers. In this image here, what you can see is a senior Askari or ex-Askari. From the caption that's on the photo, I can tell that he's probably transitioned out of active service because he has the title of Sultan. Sultan was a name that was used sort of indiscriminately by German authorities to describe kind of local leaders, people who were local administrators. And he, as you can see here, much like the photo that's on the cover of my book, he certainly sees himself as somebody who has achieved his full manhood. He's somebody who's highly decorated. He has lots of military awards. He's very proudly wearing his uniform, and he's standing over his sort of household of women and children, and kind of projecting this respectable sensibility. So in these ways, ex-Askari also performed and projected colonial authority, positioning themselves as its primary beneficiaries. And this made them highly visible as potential patrons to others who sought the protection of belonging to relatively privileged households. This was the range of possibilities for ex-Askari in 1914 when the war broke out, and what they imagined they would hold on to once the war ended. So let me turn now to part 2, which traces the possibilities for ex-soldiers after the war. So during World War I, the Askari way of war was put to the test against other European-led armies that by 1916 were better manned and better equipped than the Schutztruppe. And here I will try to make this as painless as possible in terms of giving you kind of an overview of the geopolitical, the key geopolitical points. So this is what we're talking about, German East Africa. The other German colonies on the continent were German Southwest Africa, Togo, and Cameroon. And as you can see from looking at the location of these colonies, all of them are surrounded on all sides by Entente allied powers. So for German East Africa, that means the British here, the Belgians here, British here. The Portuguese are at first neutral, but then become part of the Entente. And the South Africans, by virtue of their relationship with the British Empire, also play a role in the conquest of German East Africa. In terms of what happened in the campaign then, it should be somewhat clear from that short geographical overview. But this is the boundary of German East Africa, like this. And you can see the dark arrows that are all pointing into the interior of German East Africa, which are all showing you the routes by which Entente forces are trying to press the German Schutztruppe into surrendering. That took a long time. It did not happen until after Leto-Vorbeck had assembled his troops in this part of the colony in late 1917 after being forced out of the northern portions, and crossed over into Portuguese East Africa, which was unable to mount any sort of defense. And he essentially, for the final year of the war, dragged the Entente forces all around Portuguese East Africa in pursuit. He finally surrendered here at Abercorn, Rhodesia, northern Rhodesia. And so that's the campaign, just to kind of give you an overview. So it was a 4-year campaign that at its peak in 1916 had involved some 12,000 soldiers in the German army, and an additional 250,000 combined Entente troops. So that's why, if people know anything about the campaign in World War I in Africa, they know about this campaign because Leto-Vorbeck was held up as this genius kind of master of guerrilla warfare who had evaded this force that was, some 10 times larger than the force that he commanded. It was a highly mobile campaign, and because of that, it was devastating to the communities that lay in the path of the columns. Because armies that are on the march like this, that live off the land, and living off the land means that they steal whatever they come across in terms of food stores, livestock, people that they need for soldiering and for transporting their goods, and so on. This is another image that I think will give you a sense of what the campaign looked like. I was talking to students earlier today about the differences between the Western Front and campaigns fought elsewhere in the world. And this, I think, is one key image that can give you a sense of how different it really was. This is one kind of example of a Schutztruppe column. As you can see, it's marching across relatively flat, open, steppe-type terrain. And up front here, German officers on mules, and then all of these troops going quite a distance back. And somewhere in the very back of that line, there would have been a quarter train carrying all of their equipment, and probably even further back, members of their households who accompanied them on these long marches throughout the war. I'm happy to talk more about that afterwards too, if people are interested. On 25 November 1918, General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck and his remaining force of some 2,500 Askari and their families, dependents, porters, and auxiliaries, and 155 Germans who were left, surrendered to the British at Mbala in Zambia, as I pointed out earlier. This picture, this painting, was done by an unknown African artist, and it hangs in the National Museum of Tanzania today. And there are a few things about this image that I like to point out. So the surrender scene kind of, clearly shows the British here, Germans here, but there are some other really interesting elements to this image that I think are suggestive of how the unknown artist perceived what was going on at the end of this four-year campaign. So, for example, on the British side, there's a car. There are very few motorized vehicles involved in this campaign, but the British have one of them. The Germans have a horse. They also, you see on this side, a porter and perhaps another kind of laborer. Over here, this person kind of looks like potentially of the same status, but I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking it, but there seems to be more of an emphasis on the kind of labor aspect on the German side. Over here also, this is one of those auxiliary troops dressed in kind of a more an indigenous style of uniform or clothing versus the Askari, who are depicted as still wearing their full uniforms. And somebody asked me a couple weeks ago about the difference between the palm tree and this other tree, and I don't have an answer for that. I don't know if there's some significance, but it's a good observation. Okay, so after the surrender, the Askari took things pretty badly. There was the shame of defeat, the shame of being disarmed, being made to give up their rifles, and being forced then ultimately into internment camps while the British decided what to do with them. Lettow-Vorbeck described the conditions that the Askari experienced after the surrender and the tensions that arose because of them in this way, and I quote, "The camp for the Askari was surrounded by a thick thorn hedge and was much too small. This led to a good deal of bad feeling among our Askari, which vented itself in frequent demonstrations against the English Askari. But at length, our people resigned themselves to the uncomfortable conditions." Unquote. From that scene at Mbala, they were marched under guard to the southeast shore of Lake Tanganyika. So, again, they surrendered here. They marched to here, where they got on a Belgian steamer and sailed up, or steamed up Lake Tanganyika, where they got on a train to Tabora, and that was ultimately where they ended up being interned. And I actually looked up the distance of all of that. It was about 700 kilometers of travel that these men undertook at the end of this campaign after they surrendered. At Tabora, they were then separated from their officers, apparently with great sadness on all sides. And the officers then proceeded by train to Dar es Salaam on the coast. Hard to see sideways here. And the Askari remained interned for a time at Tabora. These images, I know, will be probably impossible for you to read, but what they are telegrams that indicate the flurry of activity that occurred between commanders in German East Africa and government officials back in London in the Colonial Office and the War Office, as they tried to figure out what to do with these captured Askari, how to handle them, given that they had been, up to that point, enemy combatants. They wondered if they should just release them and send them home. Around November 16th, the general officer commanding in East Africa received instructions from the Colonial Office to allow the German commander and officers to, quote, retain their swords, which will be handed back to them on a ceremonial parade in recognition of their gallant efforts in the field, after which they would be evacuated to Europe. So what's significant about this is that the European men are being treated, the officers are being treated in a chivalric kind of gentlemanly way. They were interned, but certainly under much better conditions than the Askari were. On the other hand, quote, the native troops and carriers employed with von Leto's force will be disarmed. It will be impressed on them that they have been defeated by the power of British arms, and they will then be dismissed to their homes. So this was about 10 days before the surrender. This is the debate that's happening among British officials. So they decide they're going to try to send them home. The people on the spot in East Africa, the officers on the spot, were concerned that repatriating some, in this telegram it says 3,000 veteran Askari and carriers, practically penniless, we should probably have very serious trouble in German East Africa. That was a quote from the commander in German East Africa at the time. And he asked to be permitted to pay the troops and porters 3 to 6 months worth of back pay in order to sort of, make them more compliant. But back in London, of course, they argued against that and pointed out what they called the considerable difficulty of trying to pay these men out of British funds at the end of a very expensive war. And so they decided instead to treat the men as prisoners of war, and decided that they should be transported to internment camps at Tabora or other centers receiving subsistence only. And then that at the end of all of that, they would be released in successive batches under armed guard to their destinations, receiving subsistence, but no additional pay or no back pay. So British suspicions about the Askari took up a lot of their kind of telegraph traffic in this moment, and it manifested quite early and never really improved. It was the beginning of the ex-German Askari's longer-term social demise and a signal of what was to come for them. During their internment, so this is a picture of some Askari waiting for rations while they are under conditions of internment. During their internment at Tabora, many died in the influenza pandemic. Some 160 Askari and 117 porters died while interned. And the disease was probably transmitted to them during that long transit they had by boat and ship on Lake Tanganyika and then across to Tabora. And, I don't want to make a big deal out of the Askari's deaths vis-a-vis the thousands of deaths that happened in the influenza pandemic in Tanganyika and actually millions around the world between 1918 and 1919. But I do want to highlight it just as one of the ways we can think about the Africa campaign as being tightly connected to the rest of the war, the global war. It's important to note the distinction between how officers were treated and how Askari were treated. Both were kept as prisoners of war, but conditions for Europeans were considerably better for the Askari, as I mentioned earlier. And so what this ultimately resulted in was kind of a bifurcation of the experiences of the German officers who returned home to much celebration and the Askari who were left behind to fend for themselves under a new colonial regime. So this is an image of General von Lettow-Vorbeck, who, as I said, was greeted as a hero when he returned to Berlin in March 1919. And there are lots of pictures from this moment, but some of them actually show the Brandenburger Tor in the background. He was treated as a hero and almost immediately folded back into German military and political affairs, which is another long story I can answer questions about in the Q&A. But he immediately began participating in the making of a myth about German colonial superiority vis-a-vis the Entente opponents. And the quote on the slide that you see here really sort of reflects this interwar German colonial revisionist rhetoric that appears over and over again in the interwar sources, memoirs, and other kinds of publications, where he emphasizes a Teutonic sense of loyalty peculiar to us Germans, which had kept its head high even under the conditions of war in the tropics. And keep in mind, too, that Germany is in this moment humiliated by the defeat and the armistice in November of 1918. So Letto Vorbeck's accomplishment in German East Africa is actually one of the only things that Germans have to hold on to as sort of a heroic narrative of the war in this moment. But the Ascari faced a very different kind of future, conditioned by the transition from German to British rule in the midst of widespread devastation and British suspicions about them. Those who survived their internment were ultimately released into an uncertain new political environment in which old ties to their German patrons became tenuous, though they were never completely severed. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I think German East Africa became a British mandate through the League of Nations. It became Tanganyika territory as of 1920, and the Ascari were never fully or formally integrated into a new British military force or even incorporated into the old one. They had to find other ways to survive. And they did so in I've identified 3 pathways, and I'll just go over these quickly in the interest of time. First, Ascari who returned to places where they had been stationed before the war sometimes lived out in their lives in communities over decades where they sort of maintained contact with each other and also cultivated ties with their German supporters back in Germany. And through that, they were able to sometimes get funds sent from overseas to help them survive in an environment that didn't have much use for them. A second pathway involved navigating kind of the new British administrative environment in ways that gave them access to a salary and to some level of privilege within the new colonial administration. So this meant that young men who had, for example, learned to write at some point before the war or during the war could translate those skills into jobs in the civil administration to help the British with kind of rolling out indirect rule in Tanganyika in the 1920s. So that's a second mode. The third one, which I'll talk about for a moment. Let's skip him for a minute. Is this man, Mahjoub bin Adam Mohammed, who had been, as a boy actually, he was the son of an Ascari, and as a boy he was trained to operate the heliograph, which was a kind of a technology, communications technology used in places that where telegraph might not be as reliable. He trained as a heliograph operator as a young boy. He accompanied the columns during the war. And after the war, he managed to find work among German companies in Tanganyika, which, despite the loss of the colony, some companies were able to continue operating He found work, for example, as a waiter on a Varman Line steamship. The Varman Line was one of the major shipping lines that connected Germany to the rest of the world in this period. He found work as a Kiswahili language instructor. And in the end, he decided to make his life in Germany. And he found work especially in the hospitality industry and in the entertainment industry. And so the image that you see here of him with this uniform on is actually him performing the role of an Askari in a Nazi-era film. He managed to make a living and to live out his life in Germany. Except that by the early 1940s, German racial laws began to foreclose the possibilities for him to continue making a living. And in 1941, he was arrested for violating race laws. He had actually married a German woman and had intimate relationships with a number of other German women. He had a number of children, and he was arrested for violating race laws. He contested the arrest, and he actually had some legal successes. This is another very interesting story. But he ultimately died in Sachsenhausen in 1944. The image you see on your right is a so-called Stolperstein. These are all over. Have any of you been to Berlin? No? Okay. These are all over Berlin and other parts of Germany. And they indicate, so there's the name of the person, a birth date and place of birth. And then at the bottom it says, arrested September 1941, Sachsenhausen, dead 24, so say 11, 1944. So these small plates are embedded in sidewalks in front of the homes where people had formerly resided. And, so these are kind of memorials that people see every day. And this is a very important one because it's actually one of the few that honors a black person in having lost their life during the Third Reich. So the reason that I dwell on Bayume's story is because he is indicative of a path that is traceable through life histories that people have done. And we don't have a sense of how many people there were like him who actually just decided to leave Tanganyika, but it certainly suggests a range of possibilities for how people navigated the post-war situation. Okay, so I started this talk with an image of two old Askari preparing to leave Dar es Salaam to go to Leto Forbeck's funeral in March 1964, and this is my last section. At the time of their trip, Tanganyika was experiencing a momentous few months. There was a bloody revolution in Zanzibar in January of 1964, so if you're wondering why I've been calling Tanzania Tanganyika, it's because until 1964, Tanganyika and Zanzibar were separate entities, and they were unified or brought together to form Tanzania in April of 1964. But before that, in January of 64, there was a bloody revolution between people who considered themselves of Arab descent and people who considered themselves to be of some kind of a kind of alternative African-descended people. And it was a horrific kind of outpouring of resentment between these two groups, causing quite a violent episode in January of 1964. At the same time, there was a massive army mutiny that occurred not just in Tanganyika, but in Kenya as well, which was another reflection of the tensions inherent in the transition from colonial rule to independence. And these men went to visit, or to attend Leto Forbeck's funeral in March of 64. So, it's just an interesting kind of collision of these different kind of currents in Tanzanian history, where you're seeing the end of the colonial era as represented by these two old men who had fought for the Germans. This army mutiny, which was reflective of African resentments against British administration, British officers of the British colonial military, which succeeded the Germans, and then also the making of this new independent nation state, in which the future of the military was very much up for in question due to this mutiny. So the former Schutztruppe Askari were part of a new demographic of veterans around the globe whose experiences shaped them in certain ways and whose politics fell along the spectrum of political positions from what I'd call apolitical to conservative to revolutionary. Thinking back to the ex-Askari I talked about in the previous section, and keeping in mind the sources of their authority, where they kind of gained their ability to function in the world, how can we think about their efforts to hold on to power and compare it to other cases in the post-World War I years? This is what's been on my mind lately. So the Schutztruppe Askari do have a lot in common with other African veterans of the war. In most cases, ex-soldiers were disappointed by the failures of their patrons to live up to their promises. And as we know, in other parts of the world, ex-soldiers became revolutionaries to varying degrees. So you can think of Russia, you can think of Garveyism, you can think of so-called new Negroes in the United States, many of whom were African American veterans of the First World War who came home to an environment that hated the vision of black men in uniform. And if you look back to this era and sort of chart what was happening in this country at that time, you will see all the manifestations of racial violence that then sort of peak in the 1920s with lynchings and the kind of the rise of the Klan again, right? These all coincide. And I'm intrigued by the range of possibilities for ex-soldiers after World War I and the conditions that enabled or obstructed them, how they moved between ordeal and opportunity, how they determined their political courses. The historian Erez Manela has described this period as the Wilsonian moment, in which colonized peoples in Egypt, Korea, China, and India mobilized the rhetoric of self-determination, hoping to embark on a path free of colonial control. Such mobilization would not emerge in most parts of Africa until much later. But thinking about soldiers' positions in this period allows us to glimpse the range of possibilities and then to ask how the ordeal of war created or foreclosed them. I would argue that for many soldiers, like the ex-Schutztruppe Askari, they chose a path that was not radical. They were not trying to link to internationalist possibilities, but they were trying to make a way. They were trying to survive in an environment that was hostile to them in many ways. They embodied radical potentials. They were soldiers, but they lived conservative realities. So they moved back and forth between ordeal and opportunity in ways that suggest the possibilities or lack thereof for others in their societies. And so I'll just end by pointing out another quote in DuBois's The Souls of White Folk, which I think, again, kind of indicates the importance of thinking about the end of the war, both in military history terms and in labor history terms, which he kind of gestured to in the first quote I read as well. So he writes in 1920, "The World War was primarily the jealous and avaricious struggle for the largest share in exploiting the darker races. As such, it must be the prelude to the armed and indignant protest of these despised and raped peoples." DuBois saw the revolutionary potential of the post-war age, but in that very same essay, he also championed the position of black soldiers from the U.S., whose service in World War I he thought honorable and indeed necessary in the black struggle for citizenship in the United States. He did not attempt to reconcile his criticism of the exploitative politics and economics of empire, which continued after 1918, with the visible role of soldiers in carrying out the work of empire. Still, this is a productive tension, and in future research, I hope to better understand the intersection of race, labor, and the vital but often sublimated presence of violence in black soldiers' self-understandings and their white officers' perceptions of them. In the end, I think this will help explain their politics through the twists and turns of late colonialism and decolonization. The end of World War I and its immediate aftermath has much more to tell us, I think, about how soldiers' politics shaped the next century. Thank you.
I think Professor Boyd will take some questions.
Definitely.
So I can just keep on.
Questions or comments? Yes.
Thank you for that fascinating and wide-ranging lecture. It's really interesting. I'm fascinated by the sense of identification that the former Askari have with their former military leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And these guys are attending the funeral of Leto Vorbeck. They presumably they were inducted or conscripted, and it makes for a kind of interesting parallel between conscription in, the conscription of freemen in Europe and for the war,
Mm-hmm.
which is of course not free, and the conscription of Askaris, and including really young boys, because Bayeux must have been only 10 years old in 1914.
Yeah.
So what about the identity that's produced through that process and the post-war identity as soldier, as enslaved, as conscripted person, and for the question of forced labor is really at the heart of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, so what's interesting about the story up to, say, 1916 is that actually the Germans managed to cultivate a I call it a myth of the loyal Askari, but it's not wholly a myth. They were loyal and they were dedicated because the Germans took care of them. So these, for the most part, were not conscripts in the classic sense. They were actually recruited from... using the term volunteer is not right either, but they were men who were recruited to fight for the Germans by virtue of their levels of experience, having fought in other colonial armies, for example. So in 1890, the reference point for many of the soldiers who were recruited from what is today Sudan and Egypt, the reference point was the Mahdi Wars that were fought in the 1880s. So these were men who had already been trained by British, in a British kind of style, and they were older, they were relatively more experienced, and they became kind of the iconic German soldier. Other troops were recruited from in and around Tanzania, and those men became kind of the rank and file. They were desirable because many of them came from groups that had been connected to the long-distance trade routes. They were men who had certain sets of skills as scouts, as trackers, as hunters, as people who understood how to get around in these various environments. So that's how the Germans formed their small army. So they actually relied far less on conscripts until 1916 and afterward, when they actually had no choice but to begin rounding up young men, any man of military age, to fill the ranks because they had lost any ability to compensate their soldiers anymore. So the ones who were left at the end, that last 2,000, were either troops who had been with the force for long periods of time and felt that their fates were tied to the fate of the Schutztruppe, or they were men who had somehow been brought in the midst of war and decided to stay there as opposed to risking going out on their own in an environment where starvation was rampant. Being on your own in that environment was not a good option. So that's a long-winded answer. I'm just talking about that one case. Certainly, if you were to look at the Francophone West African experience, you would see a very different story. So there were, because the French wanted to send thousands of troops to the Western Front from West Africa and North Africa, actually, there were recruitment drives that certainly resulted in men being rounded up and forced into soldierly roles and labor roles as well. So it's kind of a mixed story depending on which colonial situation you're looking at. To address your point about identity, I think the reason that the German case is interesting is because it's clear that the Germans understood how to cultivate the ties between officers and men through, not just through salary. They were very well paid relative to any other Africans in the colony. But they understood the importance of that respectability element, and they understood that if they wanted their men to remain tied to the organization, they needed to kind of nurture that respectability by allowing them to have as many women as they wanted in their households, and by allowing them to take spoils of war, which often were livestock, which helped them also perform this wealth. So the Germans were quite astute, I would say, as leaders, and trying to cultivate this tightly constructed group. Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much. And following on a little bit of that question, the word label Askari has very different connotations in South Africa.
Yeah.
To talk about, refers to somebody who turns from the anti-apartheid struggle against that. Do you know of, and given that this happened so soon after the scramble for Africa, it's a few decades, was there any such kind of connotation to those who entered the army and so forth? Were they looked on in a particular light by those who obviously didn't embark on the war in that particular way?
Yes, I think definitely the kind of touchstone for understanding African people's responses to the German military incursions and encroachment that occurred, especially in the 1890s up through 1907, are the oral histories that were collected in the 70s as part of University of Dar es Salaam's nationalist project. Oral histories that were collected that recounted the experience of having lived through the Maji Maji Rebellion in 1905 to 1907, in which respondent after respondent constructs the Askari as these brutes who are sort of almost machine-like in their violent tendencies. And so the Askari are certainly present, and this, it sort of depends on what level of interaction different peoples had with the Schutztruppe, right? I mean, groups that aligned themselves with the German cause, or certainly groups that didn't fight back and entered into sort of arrangements through treaties or whatever, those groups didn't necessarily construct the Askari in those same ways, but people like the Ngoni and the Hehe, who had been at war with the Germans, in the case of the Hehe for a decade, really, most of the 1890s. The Askari they're Ngeni, they're foreigners, they are people who have no business being there, and so yeah, I mean, I think there's a reason that term got picked up in the South African context, and it actually got used in World War II as well. Lithuanian auxiliary troops who assisted the Nazis in the clearing of ghettos in Eastern Europe also were called Askaris. Yeah.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you for sharing. One of the things that I'm really intrigued about in your talk is just looking at the archival materials that you chose, and particularly that, and I'm also thinking about how do we necessarily, or just thinking about the broader idea of how do we necessarily understand translation of the colonial project. And so I was kind of curious to see if you could, if it would be okay if you could talk through your narrative of thinking about how the colonial project touched the archives that you wrote.
Gosh, where to start? I wouldn't be able to do this project without colonial archives. I'll say that up front. The only other way to do this kind of project, by the time I got to by the time I was in graduate school and in a position to do this work, I would have had to interview the families of ex-Askari, and that would have yielded a certain kind of information, but it was not what I wanted to do. I actually wanted to reconstruct the history of these soldiers because they've been so they've been represented in caricatured ways. And my objective is not to kind of let them off the hook or condone anything that they did, but I was very frustrated with this, either the loyal German troop or the British killer, machine-like killer. I thought that didn't help us understand what motivates people to get involved with violence work of this sort. So colonial records were the only way that I could actually achieve that. So what I did to kind of compensate for the problem of not having very many African voices, was to assemble as many bits of archival and textual and visual information as I could to try and read them against the grain, although also along the grain in certain cases, because if the colonizers are describing behaviors that these soldiers are undertaking, I have every reason to believe them to be telling the truth because they're aligned with the state, right? So I'm kind of tacking back and forth between against the grain and along the grain. I'm trying to use visual cues to help me place them as people operating in their immediate circumstances. So yeah, I mean that was my method, and that's how I tried to get an African history out of colonial archives. Is that?
I just want you to take it wherever direction you should take. That was a beautiful narrative.
Okay, great. Brenda.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I'm kind of intrigued and interested to think about the map that you used in terms of making sense of the identities that they create, right? So they're cleaving to their current identity, but at the same time living against the identities that they hold in terms of British East Africa means nothing to our side, right?
Yeah.
German aside. So do you see that in terms of how they make sense of the identity or how they think about backing up that position? Right? So how do you make sense of them understanding this as their patron, but also making sense of their locality and their family structures across borders, consider this kind of.
Yeah, to the extent that I'm able to do that, it's because I have information that I gleaned from, especially memoirs of colonial officers or diaries of colonial officers who refer to their troops as belonging to specific groups. And then being able to trace through songs, through poetry, through kind of secondhand conversation, how these troops are talking about what they think of as home. And this comes from where this comes out most clearly is in, so Nyamwezi, these men that I talked about who had a history of working with the long distance caravan trade. They were men who, in the later stages of the war, talked a lot, according to the colonial sources, about wanting to return home. And home for them was Tabora, actually. I mean, that's kind of the heart of Nyamwezi sensibility of belonging. But it's hard. I mean, there's just not a lot to really hold on to, and so I have to read some of the cultural production in ways that give me a hint. But I wouldn't say any of it is really definitive. Right?
Sure. Would the German colonialism then be, would it be akin to a direct rule in Kenya, for example? So what would they have experienced in the sense that you talked about that shift and how with the next level it becomes an indirect British rule versus a direct rule under colonial?
Yeah. I mean, I'm very skeptical in a lot of ways of this kind of hard and fast dichotomy between the French did direct rule and the British did indirect. To me, it all ends up kind of looking the same when you sort of look at the district level administration. But the Germans had kind of a hodgepodge of arrangements that they set up kind of as they went, I think. The conquest phase was very fluid, and so every time they established a foothold in a particular area that they felt was of strategic importance, they constructed a district around it. And those districts then became the foundation for the colonial administration. Some of the districts were administered by military men, so they were essentially military bases, stations. Some of them were administered by a combination of civilian authority and military. Some of them were the result of alliances that were struck with local elites, and some of them were the result of conquest and the sort of utter defeats of whoever held authority there previously. So I think it's hard to, I find it difficult to just kind of capture the German administrative style as either or. I think they did both. They did all of it. They worked through intermediaries, but they also, in certain cases, where they, especially if they had kind of, if they defeated previous structures, they kind of filled in the vacuum themselves and installed their own people, like Sultan Ahmed that you saw the picture of, who becomes kind of a local ruler of sorts.
You hinted at this in one of your answers, but I'm curious what the afterlife of the Askari in Tanzania.
Mm-hmm.
Like we've seen some pictures here from the German point of view,
Right.
and you showed that plaque in Berlin. I'm assuming it's contested, but what is how do people talk about this history today?
They don't. And I mean, this is an interesting feature of the German East Africa, Tanzania story, because Germany, the cutoff of German colonial rule means that there's an intervening colonial narrative that gets that replaces it. So there's very little left. My sense is, I actually did talk to some people in the current Tanzania People's Defense Force about what kind of sense of if their sense of military heritage, ancestry goes all the way back to the Germans. It doesn't. It kind of skips over them. So it goes from the King's African Rifle, which is the predecessor to the TPDF, and then it goes into the kind of pre-colonial and anti-colonial military leaders who fought against the Germans. But the German Askari are not really in it. And so, so that's an interesting kind of reflection on what gets treated as relevant history in the nationalist moment. So yeah, I think that's about all I can say on that question.
give you a rest. And thank you very much.
You're welcome.